Welcome to History Twists. In this episode, we are going to take a sneak peek at a very enticing possibility. What if JFK was not assassinated? What if a single bullet never left the barrel? What if one of the most infamous days in American history never happened?
Today on History Twists, we're asking one of the biggest what ifs of the 20th century.
What if John F. Kennedy had not been assassinated in Dallas on November the 22nd, 1963?
It's hard to overstate the ripple effect of President Kennedy's death. It shocked the world, traumatized the nation, in some ways we've never fully recovered from it, and sent the 1960s spinning off into chaos.
But let's step into an alternate timeline. In this version, Lee Harvey Oswald is spotted before he can take the shot, or perhaps his rifle misfires. Kennedy survives Dealey Plaza, waving to crowds as the motorcade passes safely.
He returns to Washington invigorated, determined to push forward with his agenda. And what was that agenda? It was far more ambitious than most people remember.
Yeah, that's for sure. In our real history, Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, two pillars of American equality, both of which are under somewhat attack these days. Many credit his Southern background for pushing it through a resistant Congress.
But JFK, he had begun the push for civil rights before his death. In June 1963, after the Freedom Riders being assaulted by the Klan, he called civil rights a moral issue and proposed sweeping legislation.
So, in this alternate world, Kennedy lives and signs the Civil Rights Act himself. But here's the twist. It may have come later than Johnson's version, and with more compromise. Kennedy didn't have LBJ's arm-twisting power in Congress.
Exactly. Johnson also had the ideal of a martyred president. He advocated what he believed in anyway in the dead president's memory. So some scholars believe President Kennedy might have waited until after the 1964 election to really push, fearing a backlash throughout the entire country, North and South. So oddly, civil rights progress might have slowed, even under a liberal president.
Now, for the question that keeps historians up at night, Vietnam.
Before his death, President Kennedy had already sent 16,000 advisors to South Vietnam, but he was reportedly skeptical about a full-scale military involvement as happened later.
In a 1963 interview, JFK said, "In the final analysis, it's their war. They're the ones who have to win it." Would he have withdrawn?
Some insiders, like Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, believe Kennedy wanted out after the 1964 election. In our alternate timeline, JFK wins re-election, then slowly draws down forces. As a historian, I believe there probably wouldn't have been a total withdrawal, but there wouldn't have been combat troops. A lot of Green Berets and Delta Force and other irregular groups good at fighting an insurgency.
So, the bloody escalation under LBJ, the draft, the protests, the body bags, might never have happened. The 1960s became turbulent, but less turbulent with JFK.
Or there's another possibility. What if Kennedy had escalated anyway? Political pressure, remembering what happened to the Democrats over China 20 years earlier, and a fear of looking weak on communism might have forced his hand. In that case, the Vietnam quagmire happens anyway, only with JFK's name on it.
Here's another angle: the Cold War. Kennedy had stared down Khrushchev in the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you remember what that was, and if you don't, we can give you that information. Could he have steered the U.S. towards détente earlier?
It's certainly possible. JFK had started secret back channel talks with Soviet diplomats. He gave a remarkable speech at American University in 1963, urging Americans to see Russians not as implacable enemies, but as fellow humans.
Yeah, in this alternate timeline, JFK's second term could have opened a new phase of diplomacy. Maybe, maybe even nuclear arms reductions years ahead of their time.
And if that happens, that means something huge. No Cold War panic of the 1970s based on the defeat in Vietnam, no Reagan Star Wars program, no near misses like the 1983 nuclear false alarm. Even in other areas, if John F. Kennedy had lived, for example, and still been president in 1965, the United States response to the civil unrest in the Dominican Republic would have likely been very different, more diplomatically nuanced, less overtly militarized, and certainly more restrained than the real world massive intervention ordered by Lyndon B. Johnson. Here is a breakdown of how we think JFK might have handled the 1965 Dominican crisis based on his foreign policy philosophy, Cold War caution, and experience with Latin America.
I just want to also add a little tidbit here. It's my thought. JFK served, if you want to ever see a really kind of exciting movie, look at PT 109, tells about it. And LBJ did not. What difference does that make? Well, it's kind of different in my opinion. I think military people, those with military experience, are probably less likely to jump into war. War is hell. It isn't like what you see in the movies. It is constant. It is 24 hours. It totally surrounds, so totally captivates you if you're there. And as a civilian, LBJ didn't really understand that. He understood the death. He understood the destruction, absolutely. He wasn't a cold-hearted man at all. So anyhow, getting back to what Dr. Deneen was talking about in the 1965 Dominican crisis, let's go from April 1965. A popular revolt broke out in the Dominican Republic to restore democratically elected President John Bosch, who had been overthrown in a military coup in 1963. Johnson feared a second Cuba and ordered over 20,000 U.S. Marines to land. The operation, known as Operation Power Pack, was hugely controversial, seen as a blunt force intervention. The U.S. installed a provisional government, derailing the Bosch administration, and sent a strong anti-communist message to the region.
Now, how would President Kennedy have a different foreign policy style and what made him different? He had been a Cold Warrior, but he was certainly more cautious after Cuba. He was more focused on reform via his program, the Alliance for Progress. His ideas about military force were limited and surgical, preferably covert. He found Juan Bosch a supportive figure. He backed his election. And we have to remember the lessons from Cuba. After the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviets put nuclear missiles 90 miles from our shores and almost triggered a nuclear war, JFK negotiated and became deeply skeptical of military overreach and the hawkishness of the CIA. As you said, Dr. Weaver, JFK had served, almost lost his life on PT 109. And that seeing people he cared about suffer and die would have made him more reluctant to use what I call military first gunboat methods. Now, he might have used the uprising as leverage to force the military to negotiate Bosch's return or another democratic compromise, rather than do what Lyndon Johnson did and install a neutral technocrat like Joaquin Belair, who remained president for the next 30 years, or Donald Reed Cabral, who served as Supreme Court judge for that same time. JFK would have backed a popular transition process with international observers.
Kennedy preferred quiet CIA maneuvering over overt force. The CIA might have worked to divide pro-communist and moderate factions inside the rebellion, weaken hardliners, and quietly support a centrist nationalistic faction. JFK, with his strong sense of image and international reputation, would resist looking like an imperial aggressor. He'd likely address he'd likely address the UN and the press, framing the Dominican crisis as a test of inter-American cooperation, not one of U.S. dominance.
So let's look at a hypothetical forecast. Johnson had sent in 22,000 Marines. JFK would have sent in mostly embassy protection, only 2,000 troops. Johnson's public justification was prevent another Cuba. Kennedy would have seen it as protecting the democratic gains in the hemisphere. He would have worked, as he did on Cuba, with the Organization of American States. They played a role in our timeline, but more as an afterthought. They would have been a key diplomatic player in Kennedy's world. I think there would have been not the prolonged occupation and the anti US anger that happened in our time, but Bosch or another transitional figure returned a great deal of aid and reformist support. So the credibility of the United States would not have been weakened in Latin America as it was. The vision President Kennedy had of a progressive, popular anti communism would have been supported. I think this could have been a model for democratic restoration in other parts of the world rather than an early Vietnam style overreach. And that would have altered U.S. policy in Central America in the 70s and 80s.
Of course, we can't forget space. Kennedy's challenge to land a man on the moon before the decade's end might have been even more ambitious if he lived.
He was passionate about space as a symbol of American innovation. With JFK at the helm, maybe NASA's funding never falters after the moon landing. Maybe by 1975, we're on Mars as Werner von Braun wanted to be. Check out our Paperclip podcast to learn more about his checkered past.
Or JFK pushes international cooperation instead. One of his speeches floated the idea of a joint U.S. Soviet moon mission.
Wouldn't that have been something? Imagine that, ladies and gentlemen, a moon landing with astronauts and cosmonauts in both flags. A twist that might have ended the space race with unity instead of one-upmanship.
Now think culturally. No JFK assassination. Maybe no full-blown death of innocents for the U.S. in the early 60s.
That ripple changes everything. Maybe Beatlemania hits differently. Maybe the folk singers who played such a large role in transforming American ideas are less angry, more progressive, but less anti establishment.
Indeed. Would there even have been a summer of love without a decade of trauma to rebel against?
It's tempting, friends, to see Kennedy's survival as a utopia, But I'm sure that wouldn't have been the case. Would some things have been better? Absolutely. But even alternative histories have shadows. We might have had slower reform, less civil rights action. I don't know if there'd be a national health care program like Medicare and Medicaid, even if it is being attacked now, or another war with a different name.
But we do know this, that one day in Dallas changed everything from Vietnam to civil rights to the space race to the heart and soul of a nation.
And in our scenario, all it took was one bullet not fired. In that world, what would people like Oliver Stone be all stirred up about? It's interesting to think about, friends.
Indeed, that's the twist. Now, look, we'd love for you to join us next time on History Twist for another look at the moments that could have or that almost changed everything. And if you have comments or you'd like to give a like, that would be fantastic. Even better if you want to subscribe. But most importantly, come on back and see us again right soon.
Indeed. And may I also say, we're also looking for other areas to work on. So if you have an idea for something we haven't covered yet, tell us about it. We'll at least consider it. Take care, friends.
Bye for now.